Chapter 33, Section 3. January 30th was the beginning of Tet. This is the Vietnamese New Year. So January 30th, 1968, the beginning of Tet that year. In the past, Tet had been honored with no fighting. But in 1968, it's going to be different. Late at night, approximately 84,000 Vietcong and North Vietnamese are going to attack. They're going to hit countless villages, over 100 cities, a dozen military bases. They even hit Da Nang and Saigon. These were U.S. strongholds. And you're going to have massive fighting going on. At one point in Saigon, they even occupied part of our embassy. What they thought was going to happen was they thought they would launch this massive attack and others in the South would join in and rise up against the U.S. and the South Vietnamese government. But that doesn't happen. The revolt doesn't occur. The North is a little bit disappointed by this. What you do have is you have about a month's worth of fighting and you have about 40,000 dead communist soldiers. Even our General William Westmoreland, he claims this as a victory. You know, he was the head of our forces in Vietnam. He claims this as a victory. We lost 1,000 troops, though. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the South Vietnamese Army, they lost 2,300 troops. And even though this was widely considered to be a defeat for the Viet Cong, they weren't very weakened by it. They still remained strong. Actually, our confidence was shaken. You know, you had parts of Vietnam that we thought were safe. Da Nang, Saigon, they weren't. They were vulnerable. They hit the areas we didn't think they could hit. And you're going to have public criticism of the war increased after this. Actually, there ends up being so much pressure on Johnson that when Westmoreland asks for more troops, he asked for 206,000 more troops, Johnson only sent him part of that number and told him that was it. We had to make it happen with what we had. It is election time. The election of 1968. The president was a Democrat. It was Lyndon B. Johnson. After the Tet Offensive, Johnson's going to be facing attacks from all sides. I mean, 3 out of 4 Americans, when they polled him, disapproved of his handling of the war. And you're going to end up with a challenger to Johnson, even though he was the incumbent president. Eugene McCarthy is going to challenge Johnson for the Democratic nomination. And early on, he does show some success here. People were unhappy with Johnson. And then we're going to end up with another candidate joining the race, Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy had a huge following of African Americans, Hispanics, the poor, the young, huge following. On March 31st, 1968, Johnson is going to make an announcement that he will not seek re-election. He wants to spend his time the last few months focusing on how to end this war in Vietnam. So instead of Johnson, his vice president runs Hubert Humphrey. So you're going to have a struggle here for the Democratic nomination. You've got McCarthy versus Kennedy versus Humphrey. And the front runner out of this group appeared to be Kennedy. He had even won the California primary, a very important primary, a huge primary. On the night that he wins the California primary at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, he's going to give his, thank you speech or whatever. He's going to exit after the speech through the kitchen area on January 5th, 1968, where he is going to be shot and killed. The guy who did it was Sirhan Sirhan. We don't know why he did it. He's crazy. um, he claims he doesn't remember doing it. He was hypnotized, and there was a larger conspiracy at hand, and all this stuff. Um, as of the making of this video right here, he had been turned down for parole as of 2016 15 times. And he's not due again for a parole hearing until 2021. This especially shocks the nation because just 2 months before this was when Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. At the Democratic Convention in Chicago, the Democrats decide on Hubert Humphrey. The Chicago Democratic Convention is going to haunt the Democrats. Outside of the convention in Chicago, there's going to be around 10,000 anti-war protesters rallying. And the mayor of Chicago, Richard Daley, is going to order the police to clear the streets. He viewed these rioters as these dangerous revolutionaries, and they had to be gotten rid of out of the streets outside of this convention. So the police are going to clear the streets with clubs and tear gas. They clear the streets. Hundreds are injured. Hundreds are jailed. The Republicans have their hopes raised here by this violence, by this chaos outside of the Democratic Convention in Chicago there. And the Republicans are going to nominate Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon, he wanted support from both people who didn't like the anti-war protesters and people who didn't want to lose in Vietnam. He said he was going to crack down on urban crime, and he said he had a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam, although he does not say what it was. The election's going to be close, but Nixon wins. There's going to be a third party that runs in this election. The American Independent Party is going to run a candidate, George Wallace. You might remember George Wallace when we talked about the civil rights stuff. George Wallace was the governor of Alabama. He was the one that forbade the Montgomery to Selma march. Most of his support comes in the South, as you can see there. He opposed the liberal policies of the Democrats. He was a factor. He won 10 million votes. He won 5 states. But Nixon is the new president, and it's time to put his plan, this secret plan, into action. Nixon's chief foreign policy advisor is going to be a guy by the name of Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger, if you were in politics at this time, Henry Kissinger was the guy you wanted. He's going to be a chief policy advisor under Nixon. He had advised Ike. He had advised Kennedy, Johnson. He will eventually be advisors for Reagan and George H.W. Bush. So as you can see there, it didn't matter if you were Republican or Democrat, Kissinger was the guy you wanted. Under Nixon, he's going to be particularly influential, first as his national security advisor, and then becoming his Secretary of State. Nixon was the one that helped improve our relationship with China, with the Soviet Union. Actually, Kissinger was. Kissinger will eventually win the Nobel Peace Prize for helping to end the war in Vietnam. So let's talk about this plan. Part of this plan is going to be something called Vietnamization. Vietnamization was the idea that we will turn over the fight to the South while gradually pulling our troops out. Nixon's going to call this peace with honor. And there's really 2 ways this could work out. In your best case scenario, it's going to work out perfectly. We will leave, the South will take over the fight, and we produce a stable, anti-communist South Vietnam. But if everything went wrong, in the worst case scenario, we could still save a little face, because we're going to slowly turn this over to the South. The collapse of the South will be delayed until we're far enough away to say, well, it wasn't us. We didn't get defeated. The South did. We also hoped that this plan would help bring the North back to the negotiation table. The North had told both Johnson and Nixon, until you start withdrawing or set a withdrawal date, we won't even talk to you about peace. Now we're talking about pulling our troops out. And in August of '69, we begin troops withdrawals. Around the same time, secretly in Paris, Kissinger and the representative from the North, Lee Duc-tho, are going to begin having talks about peace. This troop withdrawal was slow. This was not a fast thing. We didn't one day have troops there, and a week later we had no troops there. So beginning of '69, we had over 500,000 troops in Vietnam. By the end of '72, we still had over 24,000 troops in Vietnam. This is going to be a slow withdrawal, but we are withdrawing. Secretly, though, Nixon had additional plans. Nixon is going to actually expand the war into neutral Cambodia. The Ho Chi Minh Trail cut through Cambodia. If we're going to stop the fighting in the South, you had to take out the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So we begin in 1969 to bomb Cambodia. This shows Hanoi. Even though we're pulling troops out, we're still willing to use force. We'll even expand this if we have to. But these bombings were hidden from the American people. They were hidden from Congress. They were even hidden from most of the military leaders. Even the Secretary of the Air Force did not necessarily know we were bombing in Cambodia. The directions came straight from the White House. Nixon's a little worried. If people start finding out that we're bombing in Cambodia, a neutral nation, this is going to look awful. And in March of 1970, there's going to be a revolt in Cambodia. And they're going to get a new government, a pro-American government. So now the bombings can be made public. Because now we can say we're helping defend a friendly nation. And we put 80,000 of our and the South troops into Cambodia. When we invaded Cambodia, the anti-war protests are going to increase, mostly on college campuses. Probably the most infamous one is going to occur at Kent State University. At Kent State, the ROTC building is going to be set on fire. And this is when the governor of Indiana basically says, you know what, we're done with this. We're going to get rid of these protesters because this is no longer a peaceful protest if they burn down a building. On May 4th, 1970, the National Guard is going to be sent in to control the demonstrators. And what happens next, there's debate. Depending on which side you talk to, whether you talk to the National Guard side, whether you talk to the student side. But what ends up happening is the National Guard soldiers end up shooting into a large group of students. 4 are killed, 9 are injured. The guard says somebody on that side fired first, shot first, did something first. Students say they didn't. They've looked and looked into it, and really there's no conclusive evidence either way. At Jackson State College, you're going to have very similar stuff. On May 14th, 1970, state police are going to fire in a dorm, killing 2, injuring 9. And over the next number of weeks, you're going to have hundreds of colleges that had students and professors go out on strike because of these attacks. Congress is also ticked off about this invasion. But it was Congress that had given the president the power to do something like this. Congress has had enough, though. And in December of 1970, Congress repeals the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, to which Nixon says this won't hurt his authority to carry on the war. And so Congress knows the only way they even have a chance to stop Nixon is to start talking about cutting off the money. You can't fund a war without the money. Anti-war efforts are also going to be helped out by something called the Pentagon Papers. Daniel Ellsberg was a former Department of Defense official, and he is going to leak what becomes known as the Pentagon Papers to the press. The Pentagon Papers is going to show, it's going to prove something people had suspected, that the government had frequently misled Americans about the war. Nixon is, invading Cambodia. He's also going to renew bombing of the North as well. Nixon hoped, that he could scare the North into submission if he hits them hard enough. Instead, though, the fighting grew even more fierce. And actually, in March of 72, the North is going to push into the South with a major offensive, to which Nixon responded by ordering even heavier bombing of the North. Basically, at this point in the war, the North held more territory in the South than it ever had before.